Welcome to A Facilitator's Journey. In this episode, I talk with James Gairdner about his journey from leaving the world of corporate, which for him at the end was banking, into the world of coaching and consultancy. We have a really great conversation where we discuss how long does it take us to move away from our corporate self into the self that is running their own business. We then talk about, are we a project shop or are we truly a business? And what do we mean by project shop and business? We then go off on a psychological discovery of ourselves and the decisions we make in our businesses, whether we're a solopreneur, a sole trader, or a business, how the decisions we're making are a direct reflection of our conscious and our unconscious, which then led us to then talk deeply about the benefits of supervision. So settle in, get a cup of tea, pull up a chair, and enjoy this episode. So James, welcome to A Facilitator's Journey, the School of Facilitation podcast. I asked this question to everybody, James, at the start. How do we know one another?
Great to be here. And I was thinking about this. I think we probably met about 10 years ago, or maybe more, maybe 12 years ago, where I think you showed up to an audition for a facilitator with my previous business.
Yeah.
That went well, and we got talking. And I think it was in the early days when sort of School of Facilitation was a seed of an idea.
Yes.
And it sounded like a really interesting and important thing, because at the time I was doing significantly more facilitation and training, specifically training work, than I do now. And the idea that someone could be taught how to do the work, it sounded like a really obvious thing, which is usually, makes it a really good idea. And B, it felt like I just didn't know who offered this, as opposed to coaching, where, there are no end of people who would offer to train you to be a coach.
Yeah, that's true.
So
God, it's that long. Yeah, you're right.
I had
It's
more
when I
I had
lived in the...
more hair back then. I was less grey. We were all younger.
Weren't we all? And I've really valued, just for the listener, our connection and our friendship, because as you are about to hear, your thinking really stretches me and your questions are provocative and your ideas make me pause and go, oh, interesting. And you've also been a really great source of feedback for me. I remember particularly during COVID, you were awesome at being a support as we now launched what we call the community pods. So you were there for that part of the journey. To help our listeners, how do you describe what you do?
I mean, this is sort of the continuation of a journey. So the way that my mind works is, once I've landed on something, I often like to move on to the next thing. And so, in a sense, this is evolving. But I am essentially, what I am is a director of a company called Heresy Consulting.
Mm-hmm.
Heresy Consulting is a clinically informed talent management business. So we specialize in leadership assessment, leadership development, and more broadly, organizational cultural change. Because the core leadership model that sits at the heart of Heresy, which actually isn't a leadership model at all. It's a model of how one creates the conditions for psychological health. Lends itself also to organizational development work. So I've been with Heresy now for 6-7 years, I guess 8 years probably, and doing this sort of work for 12-13. I mean, really, I probably met you 2 years after I'd exited my last proper job.
These are proper jobs. Corporate land is what you mean. And where were you in corporate land?
So I spent my formative years at Coke. So I started off in sales, and then worked my way across that system into consumer marketing.
Nice.
And finished my career running a brand portfolio across Europe. So I ran their sports and energy portfolio, which was very cool and very emergent, and where I had a huge amount of autonomy in what I chose to do with the brand, which you necessarily didn't get on the bigger brands,
Yeah.
which I loved. And then I moved for 3 years into financial services, which because I got bored actually, and I fortunately and unfortunately, it was at the moment at which the whole thing collapsed. So I joined HBOS in 2007. Northern Rock fell over 2 weeks later, which had nothing to do with me. uh, and then HBOS obviously collapsed September 2008, and then I
Yeah.
I worked for Lloyd's, and really that period was less about being a banker and being a marketeer in a banking world, and more about how do you take a significant group of people. I ran their offshore business. How do you take a significant group of people through I mean, it was an existential experience.
How did
Um,
that inform what you then do now?
well, I was always interested in, I have always been interested in why people do what they do.
Hmm.
What really drives people, and really all of my work, whether that be in sales or marketing or the design thinking work that I did in my previous business, or now in the sort of system psychodynamic world, I'm endlessly fascinated by what are the underlying motivations, what's going on below the surface, and that was at the time the the closest I'd ever come, and hopefully will ever come to a business, a significant, I mean, a huge business, a business that was too big to fail,
Failing.
imploding.
Mm,
And so being at the center of that and having to lead, having to manage the individual emotions that came with that, both on the HBOS side, which is this business is imploding and I've worked with it for 20 years, and then on the Lloyd's side, I've worked for this business for 20 years. We've acquired through no fault of my own a thing that appears to have certainly put a dent in my own personal wealth, and also a thing that to me doesn't make any sense. There was a huge amount of this doesn't make any sense, and therefore, and I now know why this might be, but therefore I feel I have no sense of agency. I have no confidence to act. I don't know who I am anymore. And when you get that at scale, which is essentially what we experienced in the banking crisis, where no one seems to be able to make any great sense of it, and indeed, social media, which was probably less of a thing back then, but media per se. I mean, I remember sitting in a hotel in the Isle of Man, being told essentially that this was Armageddon, and I thought, if I continue watching this, I'm going to get really depressed. So I stopped because, and the same actually to some degree was true in COVID. There was a moment where it looked really, 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 really dark. Um, and so what is interesting to me is well, at the time was how did I lead people through that process? And heresy really has given me the ability to explain why lots of the great work that we did necessarily didn't gain traction, but also what it was during that period that has had people appear so frozen, stuck,
yeah.
unable, frankly, to operate. And post the event, like when I left, I only realised this. It probably took me 6 months, a year to get what I'd been given out of my system, because it was a significant.
So the facilitator's journey, the conversations that we have is like looking at the business side of what we do. And I'm really curious. So one of the things you just said there, like it took six months to a year to almost like brush out what you brought out of the corporate world. And I think that's an actual thing, because I noticed it as well when I left the corporate world and I was in the drinks industry. It definitely took I called it coming out of the Diageo duvet. And it definitely, because I felt really, I hadn't appreciated how ensconced I was. You know, you get looked after. I was asking my accountant, can I pay myself? Because I was so habitually used to someone paying me and telling me when I could be paid. If that makes sense. Like, how do you do IT? How do you do your telephone? And that's the basics. Let alone the emotional and mental element that you get conditioned on.
Yeah,
How
definitely.
long do you think it takes for people to defrag from a corporate
I don't.
life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies, and the theory would suggest that it's a good 6 months a year. Um, I'm going to forget the name of the guy that there's a guy. Um, I can't remember his name. Who talks a lot about transition, um, and the idea that the emotional transition lags the physical transition. So
Mm-hmm.
one can move roles, one can change circumstances, one can move from corporate into one's own business. But actually, the emotional shift and therefore the behavioral shift and the mindset shift occurs over a significant period of time.
Mm.
Uh, and classically we would talk about doing a job, but in the way that we used to do our old role. What served us now may not serve us in the future, kind of a thing. But that whole process, I think, takes a period of time. In the first instance, it takes a recognition that you've actually shifted. Um, and not and there's a huge amount of fear tied up in that, because potentially it requires you to put away things that have served you really successfully in the corporate environment. And as you've suggested, with IT and phone systems and finances, frankly learn new skills that somebody took care of.
Yeah, absolutely.
and
Like,
you sort of took for granted. um, so I think that's an important thing. The other thing for me specifically about my experience in banking was, looking back on it now, that was a really traumatic event. Less for me, because I'd only been in it for a year, and I certainly wasn't, my identity wasn't tied up in I'm a banker. But if your identity and your wealth, but more your identity was tied up in, I'm a banker and this is what I do, and I work for a really conservative business. If all of that implodes, then you have nothing to define you. And that is really traumatic. It's more, it's the most traumatic thing I could think that can happen. And therefore, that, I experienced that to some degree, but it was more, dealing with, let's say, 300 people who are that experiencing it, who, as the leader, they give all that to you and you suck that up. So,
I have a hypothesis that
uh,
many facilitators and trainers leave corporate because they have a passion for a topic and they want to go and explore that. And when I said this to you in our prep call, you were like, no, I was really clear I wanted to build a business. And I'd love to talk about that. What did you mean by that? Like, how did you know you wanted a business versus, and you use the language of craft, which I love, versus
mm,
explore your craft?
mm. I, I guess I've always been really commercial, and therefore, first and foremost, so I've always been really commercial, and I've always been minded to build a thing.
Okay.
Um, and I always imagined that thing would be a physical thing, like a can of Coke or a whatever. Um, and I've been approached 2 or 3 times when I worked at Coke and then in financial services by people who wanted to build consulting businesses or coaching businesses. And I couldn't figure out how you could make a business out of people, service-based things. Um, and finally, I met someone at the right time, and I thought I'll make a leap. But my motivation was really, I was interested in the business of coaching. I wasn't hugely interested. I wasn't passionate about coaching. I've always been passionate about helping people realize their potential. I've always I'm very people orientated. I was always people to a fault, actually people orientated in my role. Probably not as cutthroat as maybe I should have been, but that's kind of who I am. Um, And so for me, first and foremost, it was can you, because as I'm leaving lawyers, people are like, why are you going to go and do that? Like, you can't make any money in that, and you certainly can't scale it, which is always a red rag to a bull for me. When someone says you
Okay,
can't do something, I go, well, I'll
let
prove
me
you
show
wrong.
you.
Yeah. And I guess to some degree, I'm still on that journey. And in many ways, I think I've gone full circle. So, um, the first business that I had, which I was probably in for 5 years, where I joined an original founder who was a coach who wanted to scale that proposition. And we went about productizing not the coaching offer, but an offer around a thing called integrative thinking, which was an early design thinking modality, and productized that and took that into a specific sector.
What do you mean by productize, just to help everyone understand?
Um, it's a really good question, actually. Um, it's turning it into a repeatable system that looks the same every time you deliver it, like a physical thing, like a can of Coke. So the brand is the same, the flavor's the same, the packaging is the same, um, and and you always have to tailor it to some degree in terms of positioning.
Hmm.
But essentially, the thing is the thing, and either you buy the thing or you don't buy the thing. Um, and
What's the benefit for us as facilitators and trainers to have a product that we can use on repeat? What do you
I,
think the
th-
benefit is?
I think it's easier. I think it's scalable. Whereas a service business that is based on bespoking everything, uh, that is also scalable, but it's significantly more challenging to scale.
Yeah.
Um, I think commercially as well, it's much more easy to predict, your commercial outcomes, because the time invested in the product is the same every time you deliver the
Yeah.
product. So, I think for me it was about repeatable, and it has always been about scalability.
Yeah. And I think I noticed, James, for a long time, I didn't think I could have a product at School of Facilitation on the corporate side. I'm thinking really at this point, and I would where I would give a lot of time and energy. I was always rewriting proposals and tweaking and tweaking. And actually, I've now got some core products within the corporate side that makes it so much easier when I'm talking to a new client to go, okay, this is what we would recommend doing, or this is your menu that you can choose from for virtual workshops or in-person workshops. And that is just helping me so much more to be focused. And also on the commercials, as you said, I can be really clear on those commercials now, and I'm not spending time and energy rethinking them every time as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess always for me the tension is, I'm curious and I'm interested, and I am a big believer that each person, each situation, each organization is unique. They have unique dynamics,
Mm,
and therefore it's very easy to get drawn into bespoking everything, because you always there's always the opportunity to tweak some. There's always the opportunity for
of
nuance,
course.
um, and sometimes the product space can feel like a deadening, and almost like you're selling stuff that people don't need. But I mean, if that's how you feel, then that's probably true, and therefore you probably shouldn't be selling it.
Yes, which is interesting. So, um, I'd love to ask you, because obviously we were talking about craft at this point and having a product. Um, but what does business mean to you? Because this is a conversation we were having as well.
I think that's a really important question, and one that we at Heresy have certainly been asking ourselves over the last periodically ask ourselves over 8 years. My observation would be that the majority of coaching businesses, leadership development businesses, organizational development businesses aren't businesses at all. What they are is product project shops. So there's always this chat about feast to famine, And I think that's a really good characteristic of a project shop. And there's nothing wrong with having a project shop. Um, but I think one needs to recognize that one is running a project shop, and therefore that requires different things than if one were running a business.
Okay, so let's
Um,
just clarify, what is a project shop to
so
you?
project shop, essentially you go out and sell work to client, which is the project. You typically design the work, you deliver the work. When that work is concluded, the project ends, and you then move on to the next project, hopefully.
Yeah.
And the game with the project shop is to ensure that you've got enough projects coming through the pipe such that your income is sustainable. Um, I think for me the difference with a business is I think businesses are grounded in products actually.
Okay.
Um, and that and therefore you create some level of sustainable baseline income which is repeatable and predictable over an extended period of time, beyond the time that one would each of us runs organizations where there will be a defined timeline over which one delivers projects. If you're in coaching, maybe 6 months. If you're in leadership development, 9 to 12 months. um, but I think you get a clear sense that you're running a business where your relationship with the clients extends beyond the typical frame of each project.
Okay.
Um,
And what could that, just to help people understand, what does that look like? The relationship with the client extends beyond the project.
I mean, I think in terms of, to me, it's about whether you're. So there's a really nice pyramid way of thinking about this.
Okay.
So in most businesses, most service businesses, and I would include advertising and consulting businesses, most businesses have a really solid baseline, which is basically program driven or project driven, which is essentially the work that you do. I think there's then another level up, which is typically recognized in the advertising space, certainly as the retained space. And I think that's less usual in the leadership development, organizational development space. But I think to me that demonstrates a level of service to the client, which goes beyond the project. You become, we
Mm,
might talk about trusted advisor. I think there's then the apex of that triangle, which is about long-term value, which is where you really are, a trusted advisor to the organization. And where there is significant value that they're accruing from you beyond the individual units that you are ultimately delivering to them. And I think over time, the objective, if and again, this big if you want to scale a business, then I think over time you need to invert that triangle so that you have a significant number of clients with whom you have, a long-term value relationship, a number of clients where you have retained relationships, and the projects are just an output of those relationships.
interesting.
There are things that you do. And it may indeed be, once you get into those relationships, that some of the things that the organization does are not actually things that you are best placed to do. And therefore you can make, particularly in my world, which is high growth scale ups, where an organization has a particular need around, COO requirements or CFO requirements or, HR specialist skills that are required. That's not me, but, I would suggest they bring people in. So you become, as I say, much more of a trusted advisor. And every single service business, I think, will talk about being a trusted advisor.
Nice. And
But you look,
actually,
go on.
you and I did exactly that. So you had one of your clients who said, we need help in the sales space. And you said, that's not my niche, but let me introduce you to Kirsty and her business wife, Sean.
Yeah.
And we did some commercial work. And I think really importantly to tell people as well is, when we work like that and when I introduce other people into my business, there is a referral fee. And I think that is so important, that it's not a, let me take you out for a drink, let me buy you a bottle of wine, let me give you a box of chocolates. It's like an acknowledgement of, I'm almost giving you a step into one of my clients. And I think and I often go to people who have introduced me and I go, by the way, can you invoice me 10% of this invoice? And they're so surprised. They're like, why are you doing that? I'm like, because this is your client and you've introduced School of Facilitation. I think
But I see. I think this is one of the, and again, for me, this is about the lens that you apply to that conversation we were having about business. Because if, and again, this is going to sound harsh, but if you took a look at the way you operate, do you operate in a very transactional way, or do you operate in a way that's geared towards building longer term relationships? And there is a huge drive towards the transactional, because everybody needs to earn money. You step out of your safe corporate role, one of the big considerations is, am I going to be destitute? And particularly given the year we've just had, which has been, to my way of thinking, a really challenging year. That is a major preoccupation for people. So it takes a lot uh, to discount the need to transact, the need to earn money, with a longer term desire to build relationship. And so in what you're referring to, I don't think people put enough value on the relationships that they have, and they don't invest enough time, therefore, in building that network, building those relationships.
And interestingly, I was talking to Mark Cranston of Total Negotiation, and he has scaled TN with the other Mark from, as he called it, the lifestyle business that he and Mark could play golf and go to the horses. And now they're a multi-million global business. And I said to him, like, what have you done to enable that to happen? And there's many factors, but one of them is this: become the trusted advisor. And I was like, how do you do that? And he said, oh, when I was driving around more, I would ring people, 15-minute chat. How are you? What's going on? Oh, by the way, have you seen this bit of information, or have you heard this bit of news? And he said he would just, it wasn't to do anything other than just to say hello and check in, but share a bit of detail. And that is very classic salesperson that I was taught back in my Diageo days. You do not have to be always going in to sell or negotiate. Just have the conversations and share some information. That will always help, or just check in. How's the relationship?
I think so. And the question often in the service space is, how do you, if you're commercial like me, how do you monetize that? But I think, when I talked about retainer, which is often always linked to the commercial angle, that retainer can come in a number of ways. Like, relationships can pay back, not just commercially, but what does that mean in terms of how you're building your reputation, how you're building your network, who these people can connect you to, what they will say about the work that you're doing. And there's also a large part of me that I in the high growth scale up space that I work, I think it's a really, really, really challenging thing to do. And I think anyone, I mean, whether it be a coaching business or a product business or whatever sort of business, I think scaling a business is one of the hardest things you can do. And so if I can, with what I know, support people in doing that, and they, as some of my clients have done, sell for multi-million pounds and are able to spend their whole life on the golf course and at the horses, which sounds ideal, then I'm good with that. I genuinely good with that, and so yeah, I think retainer can come in a number of forms, I guess, is the point.
I really like that. Now, another provocation you had is like, to me, and often these conversations start because I'm doing my own exploration, is do you want a business or do you want a project shop? And you then gave me a really interesting, we started talking psychoanalytics, which blew my head up, which is why I like talking to you. And we were talking about, basically, in layman's terms, the business that we create is a reflection of ourselves, of the person, the founder, doing the creating. And I'll get to a question. Yeah, and you also were telling me that we don't see the problems in our business because often we are the problem. Is that right?
Yeah.
What does that mean for us all, especially a lot of people out there who are flying solo and don't necessarily have others to call them out and help them out?
Yeah. So the sort of summary of the point is, there's a guy called Elliot Jacques who was who wrote a book called The Requisite Organization, which, if you like academic research-based stuff, I would highly recommend. If you don't go anywhere near it. But he wrote a couple of papers in addition to that, and his central premise was that individuals concoct organizations as a means of defense against their own anxieties. And those anxieties are often psychotic, which essentially means we're building a virtual reality. We're building a version of reality in which we feel comfortable to exist. And so therefore, in a sense, the way that I think about it is that if you are the founder of the business, whether you're a sole trader or whether you're someone who's building things with other people, the way that you choose to construct that and the way that you construct that will essentially be a mirror of your own psychology. And so therefore, some aspects of that business will work unbelievably well in the same way that you work unbelievably well, and other aspects of that business won't work quite so well. And some of that stuff, because this is the nature of the human condition, will be unconscious to you. You will not be aware of it. And yet it will manifest. And there will be people in the business who see it, but you can't see it. And therefore, often when I'm working with founders or with co-founders, that's often the first place that we'll go. We'll explore how, they and their founding story is a mirror of them and their their life. Because this, I often have this in a developmental context. You keep finding that you're doing that same thing over. You keep bumping into yourself and go, oh shit, there I go again.
Yes, I
Can
call it
I
the washing machine
yeah
on
yeah
repeat and rinse.
can I just get out of this loop? But and businesses are really interesting because for all of us, however big or small our business, it is as I've said before, it's a hugely stressful undertaking with huge amounts of pressure, some of which are existential, and therefore it's a perfect recipe for the stuff that sits in our shadow, the stuff that sits in our conscious, to manifest, to leak out.
Yeah.
So the other thing to say about that is, there's a huge amount of, I think, what I would describe as reification, and therefore fear of deep work. And I think that's misplaced. I think we cannot take deep work lightly. I think approaching the unconscious needs to be done in firstly, you need to know what you're doing, but also you need to approach it with respect. And it's common. All of us, at an individual level and organizational, it exists. And the way to think about it, Lawrence Barrett, my business partner, talks about, the unconscious is just a system of energy. And actually that energy is the lifeblood of the organization. So, the question really is, are you aware of some of these underlying dynamics? And bear in mind, you can never know, because the unconscious is the unconscious because it's unconscious. But what you can do is make some hypotheses, which are best expressed, as Jung suggested, which, it is as if. And with that awareness, with that great awareness, then make more conscious choices about, in this context, how you then subsequently choose to build the business, how you take up your role in that business, and also what complementary things, people, skills you might need in order to scale that thing.
And how, if someone's listening to this and nodding along, which I have been, and thinking, oh my goodness, yes, I can absolutely understand what James is saying to me and I'm relating. But what can I do? How do I help myself like start to understand some of this? Like, where do I go to do that piece of work?
I mean, the simple answer to that question is that people need to develop some kind of reflective practice.
Mm.
And essentially, what I mean by that is people need to step back from the day-to-day work. And a lot of people talk about step back from the day-to-day work and reflect on the experience of doing the thing that they're doing. And to think deeply about how they feel about it. Because feelings are, I always talk about feelings are data. And those feelings will tell you something about yourself in your own experience, your hopes and fears, and therefore what might be being triggered by the business and why that might be, which are very personal things.
Mm-hmm.
It may also, if you're engaged in business with other people, tell you something of the experience of the other people involved in the business. Because as my example with Lloyd suggested, all of us, when we're in conversation, you and I are having a conscious conversation here, but there's a huge amount of stuff going on below the surface of which neither I or you are aware, but it's shaping the dialogue that we're having. Um, and therefore, any of that reflection may then tell you something about the experience of the other, which may tell you something, but it also may tell you something about the stage of development of the business.
Because I get all of that hypothetically, and then my brain goes, yeah, but how would I do that? Do I do that with someone else, like with a coach, with a supervisor? Do I do it on my own? Are the basic questions of uh, what's working, what's not working? It feels like it's a deeper piece of work that I just sitting alone could do because I'd get in my own way.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think you can do that on your own. I don't think, I mean, it's very hard to see your own stuff. So this is where coaching and or for coaches supervision, um, and or I mean, frankly, therapy, coaching, supervision, and again, this is Lawrence would suggest it's no different from a conversation with a mate in the pub. The only difference is the level of capability and skill, and therefore the way that one might shape that practice, and therefore the work that you can do in that space. But the actual the actual conversation, what we would describe as a reverie technically, which is essentially a seeing and understanding between two individuals, and then a sense making. I'm sure you've got good friends who you go for a walk on the beach and you walk away going, that was really insightful.
Mm.
No different. I mean, I guess the difference for us as coaches, hopefully, is that we've done the work on ourselves, but also, robustly academically in order to understand, have some frames that help us to make sense of this world.
But what I find really interesting, James, is like we're talking about, we know that in the coaching world and in therapy world, there is almost a mandate that you have supervision and you have to be able to demonstrate that, a good coach. In the world of facilitation and training, though, there is nothing that says you need to have supervision or you need to have certain CBD hours. But people do it. I find the good people who get it do their inner work because they know if they don't, everything pops up and shows up. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on, yeah, the need for facilitators and trainers to do some of that work, because not all facilitators and trainers are coaches, by the way. So I'm
No,
not.
no, 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 but they're all human beings. Um, and I mean, you say all therapists and coaches, good coaches have supervisors. I think that's definitely true, but I think there is definitely a mandate. There's a professional mandate for all therapists to have supervision.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the same in the coaching world, and I am often astounded at the lack of supervision that people have who are coaches and who aspire to do or suggest that they do the sort of work that I'm describing. You can't. I mean, it's unsafe for you and for the people you're working with to do this sort of work without that, because you can't see your own stuff. Um, and so I think that's really important. Also, I mean, supervision provides you with an opportunity to, because of parallel process, because we construct relationships pretty much on a pattern. So therefore, the relationship in supervision will mirror the relationship that you're having a problem with, and therefore provides a really safe opportunity to explore that. Facilitators and trainers, I think you're absolutely right. And yet, because they're human beings, they are subject to all of the unconscious communication that I'm talking about. And therefore, I think it's a question of, you know, again, it probably comes back to, is this transactional, or in this case, relationship? I would substitute, are you building craft? Because if you want to build craft, then I think supervision, or at least understanding the dynamics in a room, really understanding the dynamics in a room, and how you are contributing to that, how the people in the room are contributing to that, and even beyond the room, because we're all influenced by stuff beyond the room, how the organization that you're working with is influencing those dynamics. I think that's really important, which then informs, and has to always inform with this work, a very conscious, rational, ego-led outcome, which is, given this, here are some of the conscious choices I'm going to make about the way that I work. Now, if you're a good facilitator, which most of the people that go through the school of facilitation are, you will intuitively do that. But I think creating a discipline where you do that, I think is overlooked and really important. And I'll give you a very practical example. About 5 years ago, in the management consulting space, this is, I had two consulting friends, both of whom burnt out being the level just below partner, which is a really challenging role. And it was self-evident to me that what was playing out for them was dynamics in their organization that they were soaking up, and really dysfunctional dynamics in their client, which they were essentially the fulcrum point for. And they were holding all of this stuff, but they had no awareness. So what do? You immediately go, well, it's me. I can't deal with this. I can't cope with this. They got 10 sessions of CBT and they were put straight back into, which is very personal, put straight back into the same client on the same project, doing the same work. And what happened? They burnt out almost immediately again. So I think, even in the consulting space, there is a need for what I would term reflective practice or supervision, where you get the opportunity to stand back from the work and ask yourself, what's really going on here? And as I've suggested, then be able to make really, significantly more informed, conscious choices about how you engage the client and the work you do. And the crucial thing really is, if you are able to understand yourself better and create some sense of meaning, you will be more psychologically healthy, therefore experience less burnout if you're able to do that, if you have this broader picture, than if you don't. Because there's always an element, which is the element that's going to trip you up, which you just don't see, you're not even thinking about. So yes, consultants, yes, trainers, yes, facilitators, anyone who engages with human beings, mothers and babies, which is the basis for all this work, I think it's really important.
Yeah. I think also as well, having that space, as you just said, to understand where I sit in a dynamic, whether that's with my relationship to my business, to my team, to my clients, to a project. But then also that then helps us in the running of the business, because we'll be able to see more consciously how we're making decisions, and therefore like why we make those decisions, and also where we've got my limiting beliefs, my fears, and how that then impacts the running of the business and where we go. And so
fully
another
and
benefit.
and what are the things that you're avoiding, and what systems and processes are you putting in place to avoid that? And some of that
Yeah.
stuff, by the way, is really useful. But like strengths, when they're overplayed or in certain contexts, or particularly, and I notice this as businesses scale, these fault line, these cracks start to become really, really, really obvious to everyone else apart from you.
Yeah. So interesting. Thank you. That's really made me think more about how else to keep investing in myself from a supervision perspective / development and growth. Now, quick fire questions, James.
I've been
You're going to love
dreading
this.
these. No, I don't know whether I am.
Why?
I don't know, because I'm quite, in reality, I'm quite planned. So that's part of my psyche, right?
Here we go. What advice would you give someone who's starting out in this world?
Think really carefully before you do.
For what
Uh,
reason?
because I think, uh, if I'm honest, I think the training, facilitation, coaching, consulting world is saturated, uh, and therefore, it's the classic advice is, what difference will you make? What is your point of difference? What are you motivated by? What are you really up for? And I think you need to be really clear on that. And I also think you need to, my experience of moving into this space is, don't think that the people you currently work with see you as a coach consultant. So there is, that lag that we talked about, 6 months to a year. It will take you at least that long to shift people's perception of you, to the extent that they will pay for the thing that you now do, unless you were in marketing and you're becoming a marketing consultant. That's an easier shift to make. So I think, I would think long and hard about it, and I would think long and hard about what are your real motivations.
And also, I'd add onto that, think about how comfortable you are selling yourself, because that's what you're going to do in the first instance. And can you do that? / do you want to be an associate? because there's both routes work and they're valued both ways. But are you comfortable selling yourself? Another question. Who do you follow in social media land that you think other people should?
So I'll make a shameless plug for my business partner, Lawrence Barrett, because I think his great skill is turning stuff that is academically pretty complex into things that make sense and that everyone, frankly, can engage with. So he talks about the human experience in a way that is academically robust but easy to grasp and get. So I would follow him. Who else do I follow? That's probably, I mean, as one person, I think
That's good.
that would be.
I'm going to put his name in the show notes so people can go find him. Final question. What book do you recommend to people at this point in time?
Well, if you're interested in understanding some of the stuff that I've spoken about, then a really nice place to start is a book called The Unconscious at Work, which is an edited series of articles. If you're someone like me that generally reads the first third of every business book, the great thing is that all of the important theoretical stuff is in the first, is chapter 1 to 6.
Okay.
The rest is case studies, which are interesting and I think important. But the gut. If you want essentially my 3-year masters in 6 chapters, that's a really, really good book. And then if that interests you, it's very well referenced, and there are any number of great references. But if people are interested in this space, happy to have specific conversation, because there are a number of angles, individual, team, group, organization, system, psychodynamic that you could explore.
Brilliant.
But yeah, I would start there.
Thank you. Thank you for being my guest today. I've really enjoyed our
pleasure.
conversation. How do people find you if they want to connect with you?
LinkedIn. So there are, I don't think there are any other Gairdners. Quite an unusual name. Most people can't spell it. So yeah, look me up on LinkedIn. We're obviously connected, so I'll be in your connections.
Yeah.
The Heresy website, if you're interested in our work, is heresyconsulting.com. That's the best way.
Brilliant.
If people want to call me, talk to you, and they can ring me up. I mean, email
intro.
Turn up at my house. I don't mind. Whatever.
Even I haven't done that. We'll put all the details, James, in the show notes so people can find that. But thank you for today's conversation. Really fascinating, and I think it's just so good to acknowledge that our businesses are a reflection of us, both the conscious and the unconscious, and then start to notice that and probably do something about it,
or choose not to, but at least you're making a choice, right?
It's the conscious choice. Yeah.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this.
Cool. I've enjoyed it too. Good. I'll see you. I'm sure we'll have you back another time. We'll find another topic to talk about.
No, pleasure. I'd love to come back.
Cool. Thanks everyone for listening. As I said, all the information is in the show notes that James has mentioned today, and I look forward to seeing you or hearing from you again in the future.